So, welcome back to Bio 212. You are in Nora Community College's Anatomy and Physiology 2. We are on the third preparation of Chapter 18, which is the endocrine system. And we're going to pick up at the thyroid gland and point to your thyroid gland. What I want to do is I want to remind you that as part of the endocrine system and a target of the thyrotrophic cells of the anterior pituitary gland, we have to figure out how we can regulate this gland and what is it going to do. Well, it's located inferior to the larynx. It has two lobes that are connected by an isthmus. The thyroid follicles produce two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Both increase basal metabolic responsibilities or rates. Okay? They stimulate protein synthesis, which is anabolism, and they increase the use of glucose and fatty acids for ATP production. So, from this day forward, you understand that when you increase T3 and T4 inside the body, you increase cellular activity, and therefore, you're going to make more proteins. You're going to use glucose and fatty acids as the energy source, and ultimately, you'd expect the body to get warmer. You also have inside the thyroid gland a population of cells that are called parafollicular cells, okay, or C cells, and they produce the hormone calcitonin. Okay, so let's go like this. They produce the hormone calcitonin, which you remember from AMP1, we use to bind, take calcium and phosphate and use the osteoblasts. So calcitonin binds to receptors on osteoblast cells, and it lowers calcium levels inside of our bloodstream by inhibiting bone reabsorption. Or, another way to put it is increasing the amount of bone matrix. Okay? That's what the gland's going to do. Remember, here's where it is. Yay. What I want to do is I want to take a look at the fact you actually have thyroid follicular cells. In between them, you'll have parafollicular cells, or C cells here. But beyond that, what I want you to see is we're going to make the thyroglobulin in a couple of minutes. So that means signal has to come from the anterior pituitary gland via the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, let's draw this out. Okay. We're going to go hypo, H, signals to anterior. Anterior releases thyroid stimulating hormone. You'll see how in a moment. And the thyroid stimulating hormone ultimately increases T3 and increases T4. And you'll notice we didn't do anything with calcium here. So the gland actually has multiple responsibilities, and you'll see how Mother Nature separates them. So let's go back up here again. The hypothalamus is going to release literally a releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone, so I'll just put a T in front of that. Thyroid releasing hormone targets population of cells inside the anterior pituitary gland. They are thyrotrophs. Thyrotrophs. T-R-O-P-H-S. Okay. The thyrotrophs now release thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is a water-soluble hormone that's going to target these follicular cells. And that's actually how you make T3 and T4. You'll see how in a second. Okay? So that's the introduction. How does it actually all work? Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates thyroid stimulating hormone from the thyrotrophic cells, which is going to increase ATP demand. So it's going to increase the amount of thyroid hormone inside the bloodstream. Let's see their prettier picture inside your textbook. Low levels of T3 or T4 or low metabolic rate, sort of like right before you wake up in the morning, increase the amount of thyroid releasing hormone. Here, remember, at least this time they said, look, you're going to use the hypophyseal portal veins. So let's go. I don't know if we can do anything with that one. Yeah, you can. Look at that. Hypophyseal portal veins to deliver thyroid releasing hormone. What's going to happen are the thyrotrophs now, okay, are going to release thyroid stimulating hormone, going to use the circulatory system after exiting the hypophyseal portal system. So you target those cells here, And what's going to happen is you've now increased T3 and T4. Okay? But notice, first, before we go figure out what those little red lines are doing, the basal metabolic rate is increased. You've increased the number of sodium potassium ATPases. Remember back in AMP1, I taught you that T3 and T4 increase the amount of T3 and of sodium potassium ATPases inside your body. It's going to increase your body temperature. It's going to stimulate protein synthesis. Increases the use of glucose and fatty acids for ATP production. It stimulates lipolysis, meaning we're going to break down triglycerides. Enhances the effect of catecholamines, and notice here they say some, they don't tell you which ones inside your textbook yet. And it regulates development and growth of the nervous system in bones, which means you need T3 and T4 for all of these things to happen for normal development. But you can't use that all of the time. So once it gets to a specific concentration, elevated into the circulatory system, oh, where did you go? Where did that just go? There it is. Okay, elevated into the circulatory system, its own concentration shuts off thyroid stimulating hormone, its own concentration shuts off, notice it's T3, shuts off the thyroid releasing hormone here. Okay, so T4 doesn't do so much in terms of figuring out how to shut off its own production. T3 is a significant molecule here. Okay, so I've introduced now the molecules T3 and T4. What I need to remind you is that T3 and T4 are actually water insoluble, which means we actually have to take, as T3 and T4 are being made here, I'm going to draw a little line. We need to have a binding protein. A binding protein is going to be required for T3 and T4 to actually be soluble inside your bloodstream. So it can actually do all of these, which means we would say that T3 and T4 are lipid soluble, but they're not lipids. In fact, they're made from amino acids, an amino acid, tyrosine, that is restructured. Okay? And what's going to happen is we're going to iodinate it. And your textbook goes through this in fairly great detail, but more importantly than the detail is we're going to make thyroglobulin. We store it, so TGB, and as we need the T3 and T4 to do all of these things, we simply pinocytose that back into these cells here. That's when you actually cleave off the T3 and T4, and it's the T3 and T4 that now uses that binding protein. So if that's not clear from your textbook, hopefully this cleared it up a little bit. I think it does a fairly poor job of explaining why Mother Nature is doing all of these things. Let's get rid of that. Let's do this here. Let's think about the parathyroid gland. There are usually 4 parathyroid glands, and they are measuring the amount of calcium inside of the circulatory system. Okay, so let's go like that. PTH is the hormone that's going to be made if calcium levels get too low. Magnesium to a lesser extent, but phosphate ions primarily because calcium and phosphate are the matrix of bone. What it does is it increases the number and activity of osteoclasts. So hopefully you remember that from AMP1 when we're building bone. And what's going to happen is the osteoclasts release hydrochloric acid and enzymes, release HCl, and enzymes, ENZ. And this causes the bone breakdown, so you elevate calcium 2+. And that elevated calcium is what we actually need for everything else inside the body, right? And what's going to happen is the calcium level will control the secretion of both calcitonin and parathyroid hormone via negative feedback systems. What's interesting is in this part of your text, they neglect to point out, I should say they don't stress that, of course, these are antagonistic to one another. Okay, so parathyroid hormone is antagonistic to calcitonin. They work via a negative feedback system, so if parathyroid hormone is here, you'd expect calcitonin to be high here, vice versa. So let's change colors. go like that. So that would be, let's go like that, let's go like that, let's go like that, let's go like that. And you can get this general idea as to how we maintain a range for, in this case, calcium inside of our body. Wham. So let's get rid of this. Let's start putting some arrows inside here. So here's the figure inside your textbook, and what I want to do is I want to start with high levels of calcium inside the blood. So therefore, you're going to have the release of calcitonin, and that calcitonin is going to inhibit osteoclasts, therefore decreasing the level of blood of serum calcium. Okay? Because you've decreased the serum calcium inside the plasma of your blood, we're going to have parathyroid chief cells. Let's go like that. Let's go like that and that. To release more PTH, that more PTH causes the breakdown, so you now actually have more calcium. And what's going to do is it's going to also slow the loss of calcium inside your urine, meaning you keep it inside the interstitial fluid. You're not allowed to urinate it out. Okay? It's also going to release calcitriol, and that calcitriol allows for the reuptake or the uptake of calcium from your digested foods, okay, which is what you see in part 6 here. The next set of glands that can be targeted from the anterior pituitary gland are the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are incredibly important, okay? The adrenal cortex, you actually have mineral corticoids, which regulate mineral homeostasis, and what, of course, I'm talking about here. Whoa. How did that happen? What I'm talking about here are ions. So let's go like this. Let's go sodium and A, right? Sodium ions. Yeah, glucocorticoid, which affects glucose homeostasis, and you use cortisol to do that. And androgens, which have masculizing effects. Okay, DHEA is only important inside females. And what we mean by that is it's converted into something that females can actually metabolize. Okay? The major hormone we want to think about over here, though, for the sodium regulation is going to be aldosterone, ALD. We'll come back to that in a minute, I hope. The adrenal medulla, if we remember that from AMP1, it's going to intensify sympathetic responses, the major postganglionic neuron, or in this case, preganglionic neuron, that activates the chromaffin cells to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So let's change colors here. Go like that. Let's go like this. Let's go like that. It was blue inside AMP1, so let's use blue. That preganglionic neuron targets the adrenal medulla, and inside the adrenal medulla we actually have chromaffin cells, chromaffin cells, and those chromaffin cells, when stimulated, release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Fantastic. Okay, great. Woohoo! That wasn't that hard, right? No big deal. It's not that easy. And really what I mean by that is the adrenal cortex is the major site of, say, water regulation inside your body, H2O. And it does this in a series of ways. Okay, how do we actually get to that aldosterone? We have to activate a pathway that's called the RAA pathway, RAA, okay, where you actually have to make a molecule renin, which will make angiotensin II, which will then ultimately make aldosterone. Okay? Glucocorticoids, everybody seems to ignore these. They are responsible, meaning different cortisol levels inside the bloodstream, are responsible for regulating all of the metabolism that glucose is required for. Okay? So when you're reading that part of the text, you're going to notice there's a really long list of things that cortisol actually does. Do not just simply glaze over this. Take a look at it. Okay? Finally, when we're thinking about, notice we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the androgens that are made here. Instead, we'll spend more time thinking about the layer of the cortex that makes androgens than anything else. So what is that layer? Well, let's get rid of this. Let's go over to this, which looks like something more useful out of your textbook. And I'm sorry, I couldn't get this to blow up much more to actually get information out of it. But you'll notice that here are your kidneys, and your kidneys are retroperitoneal, and here are the adrenal glands. And notice they sit, they are medial and they are superior, and they're towards the midline of the body, obviously. And you can see there's a capsule that sits around it, and you have the cortex, which actually is made of 3 parts: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis, G, F, and R. The major product of the glomerulosa are mineralocorticoids, and the major hormone that we want to concern ourselves with is aldosterone. We have glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol, from the fasciculata, and the reticularis makes androgens. On this side of our cartoon, what I want to do is I want to explain how the RAA pathway works. Okay, and we'll start with, dehydration, right? And I'm going to say severe dehydration, because small amounts of dehydration were what ADH did a few minutes ago. Severe dehydration, so SD, severe dehydration, causes a change in osmolarity, which is detected inside the kidneys at the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And that causes an increase in the amount of a molecule called renin. Renin now causes the processing of angiotensinogen. Sin. I'm wondering how this is going to be recorded. Gen. It's a gen. It's a precursor structure. A major theme in biology is anytime you see this suffix gen, ogen, it's a precursor molecule that's going to be cleaved, and it's going to be cleaved into angiotensin 1, which I'm just going to put as A1. A1 travels to your lungs, where inside of your lungs it is converted into A2. A2, which is angiotensin 2, is a potent vasoconstrictor. Vaso-C. Okay? The significance here. Remember, we started off with severe dehydration, which means you have a lot less fluid inside your body. By vasoconstricting all the blood vessels inside of your body, you now can maintain blood pressure. That A2, though, guess what? It's coming over here, stimulating the zona glomerulosa, so that it makes aldosterone, and then aldosterone now targets the kidneys to keep sodium, release potassium, and keep you alive. Because if you keep sodium inside your body, water will come to dilute the sodium and the chloride, because chloride follows the sodium, inside your body. This is the RAA pathway. You have to understand it inside this class. We see it a minimum of 5 more times this semester. Okay. Over here, if we want to think about what glucocorticoids are doing, cortisol levels, so what I want to do is I want to just simply put an arrow over here and just send you on a chase. And by that chase, I mean go look at what glucocorticoids actually do inside the body. What is the role of cortisol? Cortisol. Okay? Everybody says stress is bad for you. This is my proof to you that cortisol is actually required to keep you functioning normally. Okay? Cool. So I'm going to push through. There are, actually, you know what? There are only 4 more slides, but they're pretty deep. Okay, so we're going to pause here. We're going to start the next one. So you're actually going to have 4 sets for chapter 18, which I suppose kind of makes sense considering how important all this material is. Okay, cool. I'll see you guys in a couple minutes.